It began with a sound, faint, rhythmic, almost polite. A steady knock 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 that echoed through the walls of 284, Green Street, Enfield, one warm August night in 1977. 11-year-old Janet Hodgson sat up in her bed, her younger brother Johnny half asleep beside her. At first, she thought it was her imagination, maybe the house settling. But the knocking grew louder, moving from wall to wall, ceiling to floor, as if something unseen was exploring the room. Downstairs, their mother, Peggy Hodgson, was sorting laundry when she heard her children scream. The noise shook the small council house. Toys began to fly from shelves. A chest of drawers slid across the floor by itself, and the girls watched in frozen terror. Peggy rushed upstairs and froze too. The heavy wooden furniture moved again, scraping across the linoleum with no one touching it. Neighbors came running when Peggy shouted for help. One of them, Vic Nottingham, a builder, entered the room and saw the drawers jerk forward, then stop abruptly. "It's coming from inside the walls," he said quietly, backing away. By morning, the strange knocking had stopped. But for the Hodgson family, Peggy and her 4 children, that was only the beginning of what would become Britain's most terrifying haunting. Within days, the events in Enfield would draw police officers, journalists, and eventually the Society for Psychical Research. What started as an ordinary night in a working-class home would soon become one of the most documented and controversial paranormal cases in history. The following nights were anything but peaceful. Every evening, as darkness settled over Enfield, the Hodgson house seemed to awaken. The knocks returned, louder, faster, and angrier, echoing through the narrow rooms like drumbeats of an invisible presence. Janet began to hear whispers too, faint at first, then distinct. A deep, gravelly male voice that seemed to come from within her own chest. Peggy tried to stay calm. She told herself it was stress, that the children were overexcited, imagining things. But then the marbles began to move. Small glass balls that once lay quietly in a jar started to roll across the floor on their own, stopping abruptly at her feet. When she picked one up, it was ice cold, as if pulled from a freezer. By September 1977, the disturbances had become impossible to ignore. The family called the police. 2 constables, Carolyn Heaps and Alan Murrett, arrived and examined the house. While they were speaking with Peggy, a chair slid several feet across the living room floor. Heaps later testified, "It moved of its own accord. I checked for wires, magnets, nothing." The officers left shaken, advising the family to contact the media if the incidents continued. The Daily Mirror sent a reporter, Douglas Bence, and photographer Graham Morris to the Hodgsons' home. At first, they saw nothing unusual. Then, as Morris set up his camera, a Lego brick flew across the room and struck him above the eye, drawing blood. "It was hot," he later said, "as if it had come straight out of an oven." That night, the Mirror published its first story about the haunted house of Enfield. Soon, the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, took interest. Investigators Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair arrived at Green Street, carrying tape recorders and notebooks. Gross, who had recently lost his own daughter in a tragic accident, was determined to document the case scientifically. "If this is genuine," he told Peggy, "we'll find out. If it isn't, we'll find that out too." Over the next weeks, they recorded over 200 hours of audio. The tapes captured knocking, sudden temperature drops, and, most disturbingly, that same deep male voice. It introduced itself as Bill. "I used to live here," it growled through Janet's lips in a tone far too low for an 11-year-old. "And I died in that chair, downstairs." Playfair asked calmly, "Bill, how did you die?" The voice rasped, "I went blind. Then I had a hemorrhage and I died in the corner of the living room." What made the phenomenon more unnerving was its consistency. The voice appeared when Janet was in a trance-like state, her lips barely moving. Doctors and speech experts later examined her and concluded that sustaining such a guttural tone without damaging her vocal cords was physically impossible for a child. Reporters began to camp outside the Hodgson home. Strangers mailed letters claiming to have seen ghostly shapes through the windows. Even skeptics couldn't dismiss the mounting evidence, or the fear etched into the family's faces. For the Hodgsons, nights became a nightmare cycle. Whispers, objects hurled through the air, and furniture dragging itself across the floors. Janet was lifted from her bed more than once, her body thrown violently across the room before witnesses. Peggy no longer slept. She sat awake in the dark, listening to the voice that claimed ownership of her home. The haunting had found its voice, and it would not stay silent. By early October 1977, Green Street had become the center of Britain's strangest media storm. Cars lined the quiet residential road as journalists, skeptics, priests, and self-proclaimed ghost hunters tried to get a glimpse of the now-famous Hodgson house. Inside, the family barely slept. Janet's fits grew more violent, and objects continued to move even when the cameras were rolling. Maurice Grosse had made the house his second home. He spent night after night sitting in the living room with his tape recorder running, sometimes joined by Playfair. They weren't there to chase ghosts. They were documenting a phenomenon, one that defied every rational explanation they could think of. Grosse, a methodical man with a military background, approached the case scientifically, measuring temperature changes, tracking sound waves, noting times and durations. What he found disturbed him deeply. One night, while everyone was asleep upstairs, the kitchen suddenly erupted in chaos. A spoon bent by itself. A t-shirt flew off a table. Then, as Grosse stepped into the room, a heavy door slammed shut behind him with such force that it cracked the frame. On the tape, his voice trembles as he says, "There's something here. It knows we're watching." Playfair, meanwhile, grew fascinated with Janet. The girl seemed to be the epicenter, the focus, as psychical researchers called it. When she entered the room, the activity often intensified. Sometimes, in front of witnesses, she appeared to go into trances, her body stiff and her eyes rolling back. The voice of Bill would emerge again, mocking, crude, occasionally even joking. When asked where he was, the voice once laughed, "Right behind you." Over the following weeks, dozens of witnesses, including police officers, neighbors, reporters, and even skeptics, signed statements saying they had seen or heard unexplainable things in the house. Furniture moving, coins flying through the air, curtains twisting into knots, Janet levitating several inches above her bed. Photographer Graham Morris captured one of those moments. In his black and white photo, Janet appears midair, arms and legs extended as if thrown. Critics later argued she was simply jumping from her bed, but Playfair, who witnessed the event, disagreed. "I was there," he said. "There was no jumping. She was flung." Still, not everyone was convinced. Some reporters accused the girls of faking the activity for attention. Others claimed the investigators were being manipulated. One psychologist suggested it was mass hysteria. Another said the voice could be ventriloquism. But when experts placed water in Janet's mouth, the voice still spoke clearly. The SPR investigators, under growing public scrutiny, began using multiple recording devices and motion sensors. On several nights, they captured sudden power failures and temperature drops of nearly 10 degrees Celsius in a matter of seconds. In one session, Playfair asked the voice, "Bill, can you see us?" The reply was a chilling whisper, "I see you, and I see the others who come here." Even skeptics began to struggle for explanations. The sheer number of consistent witnesses, combined with the physical phenomena and hours of recordings, made it impossible to dismiss entirely. But the haunting wasn't just a spectacle, it was breaking the Hodgson family apart. Margaret, the eldest sister, started sleeping at friends' houses. Peggy's nerves were shredded. She cried almost every night. The children were mocked at school. Janet herself seemed trapped between two worlds, a frightened child and the vessel of something she couldn't control. In his notes, Grosse wrote, "This is no ordinary haunting. It feels intelligent, responsive. It answers when spoken to, and it watches when we don't." The more they studied it, the stronger it became. And soon, what started as knocking and whispers would escalate into full-blown physical attacks. By late autumn 1977, The haunting at 284 Green Street had escalated from eerie to violent. What began as simple knocks and flying toys had transformed into something darker, something that seemed to feed on fear itself. The Hodgsons' small brick home was now a battlefield. The walls groaned and cracked, objects shattered in midair, and the air inside seemed thick, heavy, almost electric. Neighbors reported hearing screams even when the house was empty. One night, a visiting journalist from BBC Radio captured a crash so loud it shook his recording equipment. Yet the source remained invisible. Maurice Grosse had stopped trying to sleep. He now spent most nights in a folding chair, headphones on, documenting every sound. His notebooks filled with timestamps and observations. 2:14 a.m., thuds in children's room. 2:19, growl on left wall. 2:22, Janet thrown from bed. He wanted patterns, evidence, reason, but none came. The most chilling moment occurred one cold November night. Janet was sitting cross-legged on her bed, talking softly to Grosse, when her expression froze. Her eyes widened. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. Everyone felt it. Then, as if an unseen force had taken hold of her, the mattress rose several inches off the floor, tilting forward. Janet screamed, and the bed slammed back down. Seconds later, 3 deep claw-like scratches appeared on her forearm. Peggy rushed to comfort her daughter, but the girl's eyes looked unfocused, like she was listening to something far away. "He's angry," Janet whispered. "He says we don't belong here." The voice of Bill grew more hostile. Recordings captured it laughing, mocking, and sometimes singing nursery rhymes in a grotesque rasp. In one tape he mutters, "You're all going to die here." Playfair later described that night as the point when I stopped thinking of this as just an investigation. The local council offered temporary housing, but Peggy refused to leave. "If it's in the house," she said, "it will just follow us." The family had already tried spending a night with relatives, only for strange knocks to echo through that home as well. By now, the story had gone global. Cameras from ITN and BBC rolled through Green Street. Skeptics debated believers on live television. The Daily Mirror printed new photos weekly. The Hodgsons, exhausted, felt trapped between science and spectacle. Still, the investigators persisted. Grosse and Playfair brought in specialists, electrical engineers, psychologists, parapsychologists, all trying to record something measurable. Infrared cameras captured sudden flashes of light. A motion sensor detected movement when everyone in the room was still. One experiment placed sealed envelopes on a table with coins balanced on top. By morning, the envelopes were ripped open and the coins gone. The evidence was undeniable, but not enough for the scientific community. The press called it Britain's ghost circus. Yet for those inside the house, there was no doubt. Each night was a siege. Peggy's hands shook constantly. Janet began sleepwalking, muttering in 2 voices at once. Her brother Johnny wet the bed nightly, terrified. Even the family dog refused to enter the children's room. One evening, Grosse and Playfair heard a sudden pounding. Not from the walls this time, but from inside the ceiling. They climbed into the attic and found it freezing cold, their breath visible in the air. Dust hung like fog. Then a brick, covered in cobwebs, lifted off the floor and dropped at their feet with a hollow thud. No one else was up there. Playfair's notes from that night end with a single line. "It's no longer just haunting the family. It's defending its territory." Whatever lived within those walls was growing bolder, stronger, and far less patient. By the winter of 1977, the haunting had reached a fever pitch. The Hodgson family was trapped in a nightly war they could neither understand nor escape. The walls groaned like living things, furniture moved violently, and the chilling voice of Bill spoke more often. Sometimes for hours, taunting and laughing, answering questions that no one else could possibly know. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, still determined to gather evidence, stayed in the house almost continuously. The living room became their command post, littered with tape recorders, cameras, thermometers, and notebooks. Visitors described the atmosphere as heavy, like walking underwater. Even seasoned journalists felt dizzy when they entered. During one recording session in December, The voice suddenly interrupted Gross mid-question. Maurice, it growled. You think you're clever, but you can't stop me. Gross replied calmly. Then tell me who you are. I'm nobody, the voice hissed. And that's why you'll never find me. Moments later, the curtains blew outward though the windows were sealed, and a loud metallic crash echoed from upstairs. When they ran up, they found the iron fireplace cover ripped from the wall and flung across the room. Janet sat in the corner, trembling. What alarmed Playfair most was how the entity seemed to adapt. When they set up cameras, the activity moved just out of frame. When they placed microphones, the voice shifted location. It was as if whatever haunted the house was aware, even amused, by their attempts to document it. At the same time, the toll on the family deepened. Peggy was losing weight, sleeping barely 2 hours a night. Janet's health deteriorated. She complained of exhaustion, headaches, and feeling drained. Her sister Margaret tried to keep the younger children calm, but she too began experiencing strange episodes. Waking up with bruises, hearing whispers that called her name. The investigators decided to perform controlled experiments. In one, they placed a red toy block in a circle of chalk in the children's room and sealed the door with tape. The next morning, the tape was unbroken, but the block was gone. They later found it downstairs in the kitchen sink, soaking wet. Another night, a photographer captured a streak of light moving through the air, like a thread of silver fire. There were no light sources nearby. It's as if it's feeding on energy, Playfair said. Electricity, emotion, fear, whatever it can draw from this place. By now, the story of the Enfield haunting had become a cultural obsession. Talk shows invited experts to debate it. Priests performed blessings and exorcisms on live radio. Letters poured in from across the world, some offering prayers, others demanding proof. Skeptics accused the family of trickery. Believers saw them as victims of an invisible war. Yet what truly unsettled Gross and Playfair was not what they saw, but what they heard when they reviewed their tapes. On one reel, faint beneath the usual knocking, came a whisper neither had noticed before. Help me. Help the children. It was not Bill's voice. It was higher, softer, almost pleading. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Could there be more than one presence in the house? Over the following days, the activity became unbearable. Furniture crashed, doors slammed, and Janet was once again thrown from her bed, leaving deep indentations in the wall where she hit. The voice of Bill screamed and laughed until the air itself seemed to vibrate. Finally, Playfair wrote in his journal, "We are no longer observers. We are part of it. The house has consumed us all." Green Street was no longer a home. It was a fortress under siege, and the enemy was invisible. By early 1978, the Hodgson haunting had lasted nearly 6 relentless months. The family was collapsing under the weight of exhaustion and fear. The investigators were physically and emotionally drained. Newspapers began calling the house Hell on Green Street. Even skeptics started to whisper that something unholy was unfolding there. That was when the church finally intervened. Peggy Hodgson, desperate and trembling, had gone to her local parish priest weeks earlier, begging for help. But the case had grown too public, too controversial. It took pressure from higher authorities, and the growing pile of witness statements, for the Anglican Church to take official notice. On a cold January evening, Reverend Hugh Raymond and Father David Ankers arrived at 284 Green Street. They were calm, composed men used to skepticism and fear. Yet both admitted afterward that nothing in their experience had prepared them for what they encountered inside that modest red brick house. The moment they entered, the atmosphere changed. The air turned icy. Father Ankers later recalled, "It was as if we had walked into a presence that was aware of us, and not pleased." They sprinkled holy water in each room, reading prayers aloud. Janet began to shake uncontrollably. The voice of Bill burst out of her, snarling, "Get them out! Get them out! They're mine!" The priests continued the blessing. The knocking grew so violent that pictures fell from the walls. The crucifix in the hallway twisted on its nail and hung upside down. When they finished, the house fell silent. For a few nights afterward, all was calm. Peggy wept with relief. "It's over," she said. "Finally, it's over." But she was wrong. Just days later, the disturbances returned. Quieter this time, but sharper. Voices murmured from the corners. Chairs creaked when no one was near them. Janet complained that something was touching her hair as she slept. Playfair noted in his diary, "The energy has changed. It's more cunning now, less violent but deliberate. It wants us to believe it's gone." Reverend Raymond returned once more, bringing a small wooden cross that he placed in the living room. He asked Janet to hold it. She did until it burned her palm. When the priest examined her hand, a red mark in the shape of the cross had formed. He said quietly, "This is no ordinary haunting. If it is a spirit, it resists every attempt at peace." The media frenzy reignited. Headlines screamed, "Priests battle ghost in London." Television vans parked outside the house again, their antennas reaching into the gray winter sky. Some mocked the church's involvement. Others hailed it as proof that the supernatural was real. Yet the most shocking development came not from the priests, but from Janet herself. During one of the final church visits, she went rigid, her eyes rolled back, and she began to speak in two voices simultaneously. One was Bill's, low and guttural. The other was softer, clearer. A woman's voice. "Leave the children alone," it said. "They've suffered enough." Then Janet collapsed. Gross rushed to her side, checking her pulse. She was breathing, but barely. After several minutes she opened her eyes, confused, weak. "I don't remember anything," she whispered. After that day, the phenomena lessened. The violent attacks stopped. The voices faded into murmurs. For the first time in months, the family slept through the night. But both investigators knew the calm felt unnatural, fragile, the way the air feels before a storm. As Playfair wrote later, "We thought the house had finally found peace. We were wrong. It was only resting." For several precious months in early 1978, the Hodgson family felt something they hadn't known for nearly a year: peace. The voices had gone quiet, the knocking had stopped, and the investigators began to hope that the phenomenon had finally burned itself out. Janet returned to school, trying to act like a normal 11-year-old again. She laughed, played with friends, and even slept through the night. But beneath the surface, the family remained uneasy. Every creak of the old floorboards made Peggy flinch. The children avoided being alone in certain rooms. And though the house looked ordinary again, the investigators felt it watching them. A silence that was not empty, but waiting. Playfair and Gross visited less frequently, focusing on analyzing the hundreds of hours of recordings they had collected. What they heard unsettled them. In between knocks, muffled words could be heard, strange fragments that hadn't been noticed during the sessions. One tape contained a whisper that seemed to say, "Still here." Then came April. It started small. A single knock in the middle of the night, so soft that Janet thought she had dreamed it. But the next night it came again, and again. The knocking grew louder, more deliberate, echoing from the same walls as before. Peggy knew the sound instantly. Her stomach turned cold. "It's back," she whispered. When Playfair arrived days later, he found the family shaken but resigned. "We tried to ignore it," Peggy said, "but it's like it knows when we stop believing." The activity returned with new intelligence. Instead of hurling toys or moving furniture, it played with perception. Lights flickered in rhythmic patterns, almost like Morse code. Doors creaked open slowly and closed again, as if the presence were pacing the house. The family began to hear faint laughter. Not Bill's voice, but several voices, overlapping, whispering at the edges of hearing. Janet's behavior began to change again. Teachers at her school reported seeing her drift off during lessons, staring blankly into space. At home, she complained of feeling pulled toward certain corners, as if something unseen was guiding her movements. When she drew pictures, they were dark. Staircases, closed doors, a face without eyes. One evening, Playfair witnessed something that chilled him to the core. As Janet sat in the living room, her expression suddenly changed. She smiled faintly, but it was not her smile. Her head tilted, and in a voice not her own she said, "You thought I was gone, didn't you?" The tape recorder captured everything. Playfair's trembling voice answered, "Who are you now?" "More than one," it replied. He opened the door. "Now we all can come." After that, the house once again fell into chaos. Toys flew across rooms. Objects disappeared and reappeared in impossible places, and knocking erupted from all sides. Yet the most disturbing element wasn't the violence. It was the precision. The knocks seemed to respond to questions, forming patterns, spelling out names. Gross began experimenting, asking yes or no questions aloud. The entity replied with one knock for yes, two for no. When he asked, "Are you Bill?" there was silence. Then 3 knocks, a new code. Playfair whispered, "It's something else now." The haunting had evolved. It was no longer just one spirit, one story, one tragedy. It was a doorway. By summer, both investigators agreed that the Enfield case had changed in ways they couldn't explain. The activity now came and went unpredictably, vanishing for weeks only to return without warning. The family was living on edge, half expecting each calm night to be their last. In one of his last notes from 1978, Gross wrote simply, "The silence isn't peace. It's preparation." Summer 1978 should have been a time of recovery for the Hodgson family. Instead, it became the season when the house found its voice again. What had been months of uneasy quiet turned suddenly to chaos once more, and this time it was different. The voices that came through Janet were no longer limited to Bill. There were others now. It began one warm June evening. The family was finishing dinner when the familiar knocking started again. 3 sharp raps against the kitchen wall. Peggy froze, spoon in hand. Before anyone could move, the light flickered, and Janet's chair jerked backward on its own. She didn't scream this time. She just stared, blank and pale, as a deep voice rumbled from her throat. "You didn't listen." Peggy dropped her plate. "Who are you?" she whispered. The voice laughed, but then another joined it, higher, almost childlike. The room filled with overlapping murmurs, a jumble of tones that rose and fell like a grotesque chorus. When it ended, Janet slumped forward, gasping for air. Gross and Playfair were called immediately. They arrived within the hour, setting up their recorders once again. This time, the voices appeared on command. When Gross asked, "How many of you are there?" the reply came instantly. 6, maybe 7, maybe more. It was the most chilling session they had ever recorded. The voices argued among themselves, shouting, cackling, even singing a warped version of "London Bridge is Falling Down." At one point, a distinctly female voice said, "We come when he calls." The doors open now. The investigators were stunned. They checked Janet's throat afterward. She was hoarse, but otherwise unharmed. No human child could produce such overlapping sounds. Even ventriloquists couldn't imitate it. The recording, when played back later, revealed frequencies below the range of a normal human voice. But what disturbed Gross most wasn't the sound, it was the content. The voices seemed to know things. They mentioned events from before the Hodgsons had moved in. The death of an old man named Bill Wilkins, yes, but also references to others. A girl drowned in a canal, a soldier who never came home. Playfair began to suspect the haunting was layered. Not a single ghost, but an echo chamber of tragedy, all anchored to one location. Around this time, Janet's sleepwalking returned, more violent than before. Peggy often found her daughter standing in the hallway at 3 a.m., whispering to the darkness. Once, she was discovered trying to open the front door, muttering, "They want me to go outside." When asked later what she meant, Janet said she didn't remember. Meanwhile, the voices grew bolder. They no longer waited for the night. In daylight, the family heard whispers coming from empty rooms. Objects moved in front of visitors. Even the skeptical neighbors admitted seeing things they couldn't explain. One afternoon, Playfair brought in a psychologist to observe Janet under controlled conditions. Electrodes were attached to her skin to measure muscle activity. As soon as the test began, the voice spoke, and the readings spiked erratically. The data suggested that the sound didn't originate in her vocal cords at all, but somewhere deeper, as if it resonated from within her chest cavity. The psychologist, pale and shaking, packed his instruments and refused to return. In his notes, Playfair wrote, "The voices are not fading. They are multiplying. The house no longer echoes with one ghost. It resonates with many. We may not be studying a haunting, but an infestation." By late August, the activity reached its peak once more. The family lived in constant dread, never knowing which version of the voice would appear next. The mocking bill, the crying child, or the whispering chorus that sounded like hundreds of people speaking at once. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it all went quiet again. The silence this time felt wrong, dense, suffocating, almost alive. No one celebrated. They knew what it meant. It wasn't over. It was waiting. By autumn of 1978, the Enfield case had consumed everyone involved. What had started as an investigation into unexplained noises was now something deeper, stranger, and darker. Both Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair found themselves pulled beyond the boundary between researcher and participant. The haunting was no longer just happening to the Hodgsons. It was happening through everyone who entered the house. The investigators began to notice odd coincidences following them outside of Green Street. Playfair's tape recorder switched on by itself in his own home. Grosse's car radio flickered with bursts of static whenever he drove past the church. Their watches would stop, then restart at the exact same time. "It's as if it followed us," Playfair wrote. "The house has grown roots beyond its walls." At 284 Green Street, the atmosphere had changed again. It was quieter but heavier, the kind of silence that pressed on the skin. Janet seemed subdued, older somehow, though she was only 12. Her drawings became darker, filled with staircases that led nowhere and shapes that had no faces. The voices had returned, softer, more cunning. They no longer shouted or threatened. Instead, they whispered things only the family could hear. Private memories, hidden fears. Peggy heard her late husband's voice one night, calling her name from the hallway. Margaret dreamed that something was standing at the end of her bed, watching, whispering that it wanted her to come downstairs. When Grosse arrived the next morning, he found all the doors in the house wide open, every single one. Determined to end the ordeal, the investigators called in more experts. Parapsychologists, sound engineers, even a magician, all hoping to expose a trick or find a pattern. But every test deepened the mystery. Infrared photography revealed cold spots that moved, areas of air 15 degrees colder than the rest of the room, drifting like invisible clouds. Microphones picked up infrasound, ultra-low frequencies known to cause anxiety and hallucinations, but the source could not be traced. Even the skeptics admitted the data didn't fit any known explanation. Then came the incident that nearly ended the investigation. During one late-night session in November, Janet began to scream. Not her usual high-pitched cry, but a guttural, raw sound that froze everyone in place. She clutched her throat and fell to the floor, gasping. As Grosse and Playfair rushed to her, they saw the curtains move, though no wind blew. On the wall, a small cross slowly rotated until it hung upside down. Then, from Janet's body, came a new voice, calm, male, measured. "You should not be here," it said. "You do not understand what you're touching." The words echoed through the room, recorded clearly on tape. When played back later, Grosse noticed something chilling. The voice carried harmonics that matched his own. For the first time, he considered a horrifying possibility. That the phenomenon wasn't just haunting the Hodgsons, but reflecting those around it. Amplifying emotions, mimicking voices, feeding on belief itself. Playfair, shaken, wrote that night, "We thought we were studying a haunting, but perhaps it studies us." After that night, Grosse's demeanor changed. Friends said he grew distant, distracted. He began speaking of patterns and intelligences that extended beyond one location, a kind of network, linked through emotion, fear, and death. He told Playfair, "The house is just one node. The connection is us." Meanwhile, the family continued to suffer. Janet's health declined again. Her mother grew frail and withdrawn. The younger children refused to sleep upstairs. The investigators knew they were approaching a breaking point, but no one dared to stop. They were too deep. In one of his last 1978 diary entries, Playfair scrawled a single, haunting line. "The haunting has changed shape. It's no longer bound to walls. It's bound to us." The winter of 1978 settled over Enfield like a shroud. By then, the haunting had become a part of daily life for the Hodgsons. Something endured, like bad weather or illness. But as the year drew to a close, everything built toward a final, terrifying crescendo. The house at 284 Green Street seemed alive again, pulsing with a presence that felt angrier, more desperate, and closer than ever before. It began on a night in early December. Janet had been unusually quiet all day, withdrawn and pale. At dinner she barely ate, staring at the window as though listening to something beyond it. "He's coming," she whispered suddenly. Peggy tried to soothe her, but Janet's voice was flat, distant, almost prophetic. That night, around 1:30 a.m., the house came alive. The knocks started first, sharp, violent blows that shook the walls. Then came the screams, a sound so piercing that neighbors called the police. Inside, furniture toppled, drawers flew open, and the air grew thick and cold. Gross and Playfair rushed to the house, arriving minutes later. They found Peggy clutching her younger son in the hallway, sobbing. Upstairs, Janet's room was in chaos. The curtains were torn down, the mattress flipped, and Janet herself was floating. Not high, but several inches above her bed, her body rigid. Playfair shouted her name. No response. Her eyes were rolled back, her mouth moving, forming words that were not her own. The tape recorders caught everything. "You should have left. We told you to go. Now he comes." The voice was different again. Deeper, more resonant, vibrating the very air. Suddenly, a picture frame flew from the wall and shattered inches from Gross's head. The investigators tried to restrain Janet, but she was freezing cold, her pulse rapid. The sound grew unbearable. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from inside the walls. Then the electricity cut out. The entire street fell dark. What happened next would remain the most debated moment in the entire Enfield case. According to both investigators, a bright light appeared in the corner of the room. Not blinding, but glowing, like heat lightning behind a veil. In the glow, a shape formed, the outline of a man, stooped, indistinct, watching. Peggy screamed, and the figure faded instantly. The lights came back on. Janet collapsed, unconscious. The chaos stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The house was silent again, but the silence this time felt final. Not a pause, but an ending. Janet remained unconscious for nearly 2 hours. When she awoke, she was weak but calm. "I saw him," she whispered. "He was old and tired. He said it's finished." Gross and Playfair stayed the rest of the night, afraid to leave. They found no signs of trickery, no wires, no magnets, no explanation. Just a family sitting together in the pale morning light, too tired to speak. In the days that followed, the activity faded completely. No more voices, no more movement. Even the temperature in the house stabilized. For the first time in over a year, the Hodgsons lived in peace. When journalists returned weeks later, they found nothing. No eerie sounds, no evidence, just an ordinary family trying to rebuild a normal life. Yet none of them would ever be the same. In his final field report, Playfair wrote, "Whatever haunted Enfield did not vanish. It simply ended its performance. We were witnesses not to a haunting, but to a communication. And when its message was delivered, it left." For a time, life on Green Street seemed to return to normal. By early 1979, the Hodgsons tried to rebuild what the haunting had shattered. Their peace, their privacy, their belief in ordinary life. Journalists stopped visiting, investigators packed away their tapes, and the world slowly moved on to the next strange story. But for the people who had lived it, Enfield never truly left. It lingered, in whispers, in dreams, in the quiet between breaths. Janet seemed changed the most. She went back to school, smiled more, and spoke rarely of what had happened. But at night, she still woke suddenly, claiming she heard faint knocking under the floorboards. Her mother would tell her it was only the pipes. Janet would nod, but she knew the rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then one more. Maurice Grosse continued to study the case long after the headlines faded. He gave lectures, presented recordings, and defended the family against skeptics who accused them of deceit. "I know what I saw," he would say, "and I know what I heard." Yet even he admitted the mystery was incomplete. In one private letter he wrote, "If I learned anything from Enfield, it's that belief and disbelief are just 2 sides of the same fear." Guy Lyon Playfair turned his notes into a book, This House is Haunted. He approached the story not as a believer or a skeptic, but as a witness. In interviews, he often paused when asked whether he thought the haunting was real. "Let's just say," he'd answer, "that something happened there, something that defied us all." As the years passed, the Hodgsons moved away from Enfield. The house changed owners several times. Some claimed they felt nothing unusual. Others moved out quickly, without explanation. Neighbors said the lights still flickered some nights, though no one lived inside. In 1980, a BBC team returned to film a follow-up documentary. The house looked quiet, peaceful. But when the crew reviewed their sound recordings later, they found something strange. A single, faint voice captured in the background. It said only 2 words, "I'm here." No one could explain it. Janet, as an adult, rarely spoke publicly about her childhood. When she did, her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. "It's not something you forget," she told a reporter years later. "It follows you, not the ghost exactly. The feeling, the cold in the air before it happens." Peggy Hodgson lived in the same house until her death in 2003. The new owner, a mother with a young son, later claimed they occasionally heard children laughing upstairs when no one was there. Even decades later, the case of the Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most documented hauntings in modern history, investigated by scientists, priests, skeptics, and believers alike. The hundreds of recordings, photographs, and eyewitness testimonies continue to divide opinion. Was it a hoax, a shared delusion, or genuine proof of something beyond human understanding? No one ever proved it either way. In his final years, Grosse was asked if he still believed. He smiled sadly and said, "Belief has nothing to do with it. I was there." The house at 284 Green Street still stands, ordinary, unassuming, its red bricks weathered by time. Children play outside, unaware of the story that once gripped the world. But sometimes, when the wind blows through Enfield just right, locals swear they can hear a faint knocking echoing down the street. 3 taps, a pause, and one more. And then, silence. Decades have passed since the last knock echoed through 284 Green Street, yet the Enfield Poltergeist continues to cast its shadow across the world of the unexplained. What began as a local disturbance in a working-class home became a global phenomenon, one that forever blurred the line between belief and disbelief, science and spirit, fact and fear. The tapes, photographs, and testimonies from the case remain among the most extensive records of alleged paranormal activity ever collected. More than 2,000 separate incidents were documented. Objects moving without contact, levitations, temperature drops, disembodied voices. For skeptics, the Enfield case stands as a warning about suggestion, hysteria, and the human hunger for mystery. For believers, it is one of the most convincing proofs that consciousness, or something like it, survives death. In the years that followed, universities and research institutions quietly analyzed the material. Some concluded the voices could be subconscious expressions, a form of psychokinetic release triggered by trauma. Others, like Grosse and Playfair, insisted that no psychological theory could explain what they had witnessed firsthand. Science, Playfair wrote in his final essay, must learn humility when facing the unknown. The story inspired films, books, and television series, from documentaries to dramatizations like The Conjuring 2. Each retelling twisted the truth slightly, blending horror with history, turning the Hodgsons' suffering into legend. Yet beneath the Hollywood gloss, the heart of the story remained the same. A family who could not escape the unexplainable, and two men who risked ridicule to seek the truth. Janet grew up to live a quiet life. In rare interviews, she admitted she sometimes still feels that coldness, the same chill she felt before the knocking began. "I don't care if people believe me or not," she once said. "We know what happened. We lived it." Maurice Grosse died in 2006. According to his daughter, strange noises were heard in their home the night after his passing. 3 knocks, a pause, then one more. Guy Lyon Playfair continued to write and lecture about Enfield until his death in 2018. In his last recorded talk, he smiled gently when asked if he ever found peace with the case. "Peace," he said. "You don't find peace after Enfield. You just learn to live with the questions." Today, the house at 284 Green Street still stands, its windows replaced, its paint faded. The street looks ordinary, its silence comforting. But those who pass by sometimes stop and glance at the upper windows, as if expecting to see the faint outline of a girl watching, listening. Because Enfield, in the end, was never just about ghosts. It was about the limits of human understanding, the need to explain what may never be explained, and the thin, trembling line that separates the living from whatever waits beyond. Perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because it proves that ghosts are real, but because it reminds us that we might not know what real truly means. And somewhere, in the memory of that small London house, the air still remembers. If you listen closely enough, you might hear it. Quiet, rhythmic knock, knock, knock.